We can't start.
That's right. Gotta watch the countdown over here.
What? I'm trying to get a mic check. Okay, yep, I'm talking right now. Your mic on? I believe so. The on switch, right? Unmuted. On top. Oh.
What was the question?
Yep, it's unmuted. Yep, unmuted.
One more time.
Unmuted, yes. It's
Welcome. The PMRV Worship and Spirituality Committee would like to welcome all of you to this Theology of Hymnody event. We are delighted to have you here, and we are delighted to have those of you who are watching us online here too. I want to welcome the Reverend Dr. Christine Dempsey, who is Associate Pastor at Church of the Cross in Omaha, and Dr. Chris Krampe, who is Director of Music right here at Presbyterian Church of the Master. And I am delighted to hear what they have to say and how they're going to teach us about hymnody. So thank you very much for being here.
Well, it is really good to be here, and I appreciated the opportunity to share with you what I know about hymns. And most people are like, well, you're an associate pastor. Where did this hymn tradition come from with you? And so I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I am waiting for our slideshow to pop up for us. I have some images on that that will be helpful for us. There we go. And you can move on to the next one already. So just today, this is kind of the outline of what I'm going to talk about. And I have about 20 minutes, and Chris has about 20 minutes, and then we'll then we'll sing something and can kind of conclude with just a little analysis of a hymn in my case, and he has something special for you as well. Our backgrounds are both in hymns, but we both have completely different directions we've taken our work. So we'll start with just this little welcome piece, and then I'll talk just a little bit about the early church and music in it. Both my work and Chris's work are going to come from that work that is done in the medieval church. So we have to have just a little bit of knowledge, so I'll talk about it and he'll add more pieces on top of that as he branches off into some of his things. And then I'm going to talk about the birth of what we know as the birth of evangelical hymnody, going along with the Protestant Reformation. And then just kind of some of the directions that starts to go, which includes our Presbyterian tradition. You can go next slide. It reminded me, I updated these, but I didn't get the update in, but I did want to read this to you. This quote, before we head on, is from a hymn book that was published in 1561, but I just love this introduction piece. And it says, "At all times, man has loved the Christian song, but has found all worldly songs worthless. So you have learned with little work how to turn to God the Father with delight and joy. All this comes from spiritual songs, whether sung or read. I ask that you not be idle, but strive to do his will, that you will understand and learn with your heart, and out of it a devout change will arise in you." So before we head on, you're thinking, what is my background? Why am I doing this? So prior to going to seminary, and I'm actually a new pastor, I didn't do that until 2019, I was a professor at the University of Nebraska in early modern Europe, and specifically studying Reformation hymnody. That's a strange place to be in as a historian, because normally the world hymnody belongs in kind of the world of musicology. But I looked at them as a historian for how they were used as teaching tools to teach the tenets of the faith during the Reformation. That means Lutheran hymnody, and I'll talk a little bit more why that is. So I studied specifically hymns from 1523, which is when we see the very first publications of specifically evangelical hymns, up to 1587, and that was in the Lutheran tradition, their Westminster Confession, if you will, if you're Presbyterian here, is the Book of Concord. And so 1587 marks the first hymn book that is published specifically on the tenets that are put out in the Book of Concord. So you're going to see references to a lot of 16th century German hymn books as I move ahead. Go ahead with the next one. So before we can get there, we really do need to talk just a little bit about the medieval church. So we have, of course, the ancient church with our church fathers. We're going back to the early writings, the Council of Nicaea, the Nicene Creed. And that is all within the Roman Empire. But when the Roman Empire falls in approximately 500, the church itself kind of goes underground, and what we find are worship practices are kind of everywhere. So during the medieval church, some of the leaders in the church, Pope Gregory in particular, are known for bringing together consistent elements of worship. And by the time we hit the high Middle Ages, we actually have a pretty consistent practice of the Mass. And we begin to see actual music being written for it. So this music, prior to, I think it's the 9th century, we really don't have any musical notation at all. Slowly we'll see music start to be notated as we hear chant going along, so people know what to sing. And I gave an example of that up here, where these early neumes are showing the up and down, and people can hear it and then kind of figure out where they go with it. And by the way, I know people that sing on Broadway, and this is how they do it. They have their words, and they don't read music. They mark it like this, and then they listen, and they learn it by ear. I have a friend that complains about it all the time, because how can these Broadway singers not read music? But it's actually pretty common. This will eventually make its way into notation that we're familiar with. We'll see staves, we'll see key signatures, we'll see notes that begin to look more like notes move in. And I didn't show that whole history here. But it's important to know this is all happening in the church. So when we have written music, that it's coming through that tradition. There's many other types of music, of course, going on. We know that, right? We know that from our scripture. We don't know what it sounded like. We don't know what it sounded like when the Jews were singing the Psalms, if you will. But we begin to know what it sounds like as we begin to understand what this, and read through this chant, and as it comes down with this combination of oral tradition and with the written tradition that's with it. So secular songs, once this is established, then also pick up this recording practice of the church. So then we start to get secular songs that also have notation with it. That's important for us as well, because by the time we hit the Reformation, we're going to have some kind of musical practice in mind that both those musicians can use as well as secular musicians. Before I head out of this slide, I have up an image here of the medieval world. And I think the important thing here to point out is the medieval world kind of divided themselves between those who work, those who pray, and those who fight. So if people were coming to Mass, they were really observers to it. Everything, if you've been in a medieval cathedral, you know that look, and you'll know that they practice the Mass, and their backs are towards the people who would be in the congregation. And you are watching, but you're not really partaking in it like you would in a Protestant service. This idea that you're singing along and part of the service is not important, but that they're doing the actions of and the ritual of the church. That's their job. That's the job of the priesthood. It's all done in Latin. No one sitting out there understands what's going on. They don't speak Latin. They don't read Latin. They don't really have access to scriptures. Some of the rich people might have had a Bible, but they couldn't read it, except in a few cases. And if you were upper class, perhaps, and you had gone to Latin school, or, of course, if you were a member of the clergy. So one of the big pushes of the Reformation is going to be priesthood of all believers. And one of the principles of that is believers have to be able to read. They have to be able to know the scripture. And as scriptures become available in the vernaculars, so too do hymns. And this is where the big push comes from. You can go to the next slide. So I have up here the slide depicting some of the elements of the Reformation theology. And one of the things you see in hymns are really these tenets of Reformation theology. I have Luther there at the bottom in a little circle. And we often look at Luther as the father of evangelical hymnody. And it's really through his push that people need to be able to read and need to be able to understand what they believe, understand the Bible stories themselves, that we get this kind of new body of hymnody. The myth is, however, and Chris knows a great deal about this as well, that he didn't invent hymnody. We have secular hymnody from before that. It's not used in the service, but we also have vernacular sermons that are prior to the Reformation. Again, not done during the Mass, but done outside. So we have a body of hymnody that he's familiar with. Not much of it's in German, or not enough of it he's interested in, and it doesn't convey the theology he wants it to convey, because he understands that music can be a great way for people to learn. And actually, in my research, I found over the years this emphasis of, if we can only teach kids songs with the right words, they could take it home and teach their parents what it really means, to be a good Christian. And so that was really part of the emphasis, was how kids can learn the music easily. And we know that, right? How often Jesus loves me, and a little kid comes home and they know that song and they know what it means. And they teach it to their parents. So in Luther's hymnody then are going to be emphases on salvation by faith alone, salvation by grace, priesthood of all believers. We're going to look at one and a little later at the end that you have there, where you're going to see some of these themes coming out. It's very interesting. Another thing that's important, we talk about Protestant Reformation, as you know, it's a religious movement, but it's also a social movement, and it goes right along with the printing press and the first printed publications. And the success of hymnody probably would be limited, or evangelical hymnody would be limited without the printing press. 1450, we get the first press coming out in the West, right? China has had it for some time. The first movable type press coming out. The first 50 years of that they begin printing things, but it's a slow process. They're trying to make them look like medieval manuscripts, right, that are beautifully illuminated. Who's seen the St. John's Bible, right? So that was an idea to create that kind of medieval look where they would illuminate everything. But about 1500, they start just printing stuff. It's not very pretty stuff, by the way. They start to get rid of the beautiful illumination, and they just start churning it out. But what it does, it brings the price down, and all of a sudden people start buying stuff. And the few people that can read in the vernaculars are saying, oh my gosh, there's stuff that we can read. And pretty soon it takes off. And hymnody becomes part of this whole printing press extravaganza. And that's one of my main emphases, actually, was how important this was. Because we think of the hymn business as being so sacred, and yet there's some really nasty stuff that goes on when it comes to printing presses. Next slide. It's pretty funny. I put up a nice picture of Luther there, an idealized image a little later, but just he was such a lover of music. And I think his passion and love for music, and he's a true musician, right? He wrote music, he played the lute, and loved to share music with his family. Moving on, next slide. So kind of taking us to some of the things that go on. Well, as these things are being printed, we find that they're printed without any authority, and then they'll steal, like, from another printer, and someone will print it off claiming someone else printed it, trying to gain money from it. It becomes a big money maker. I'll go a little bit more into that in a minute. So Luther, though, back to his idealized world of getting people to sing, makes this big call for people to write hymns. And that this is going to be kind of the cornerstone of the Reformation in many ways. I give it more credit than some people do, but it's my research. So I want to read this to you. This is in a letter to George Spalatin, and he becomes one of the big hymn writers along with Luther, and one of the people to help promote this, because several people are going to respond to this letter. And we don't have the other extant letters, but scholars are pretty sure there's letters to several of his friends that he thinks might be good at writing hymns. So here's what he writes, part of it. Our plan is to follow the example of the prophets and the ancient fathers of the church, and to compose songs for the people in the vernacular, that is, spiritual songs, so the word of God may be among the people also in the form of music. Therefore, we are searching everywhere for poets. Since you are endowed with a wealth of knowledge and elegance in the German language, and since you have polished it through much use, I ask you to work with us in this project. I would like you to avoid any new words or the language used at court. In order to be understood by the people, only the simplest and most common words should be used for singing. At some time, however, they should be pure and apt, and further, the sense should be clear and as close as possible to the Bible. You need a free hand here. Maintain the sense, but don't cling to the words, rather translate them with other appropriate words. Go on, the next one is fine. And he gets quite a few people to respond. Most of these we don't sing anymore. Some of these are really interesting people, but we get a first collection of hymns. The very first ones are actually published in, go ahead and move the screen forward. A series of some of our first hymn books. The very first one there, and the image I have, is the first publication of the Ach Liederbuch. I think that's one I put up there. Yeah, the Ach Liederbuch, which is the very first publication of hymns we have. There's eight songs in it. I think if you go read most people talking about history of hymnody, they'll claim that, it's a little hymn book. I think it was published actually personally in like pamphlets and then put together as one later on. And the reason I do, there's a Konrad Ameln, who's an early scholar of church hymnody, argued that. And then when I did my own research at the Herzog August Bibliothek, I found two pieces of the hymn without the other one, kind of suggesting to me that it was published in separate little pamphlets and then pushed together. And just so you know, during this period, you didn't buy books like we have today. You didn't have this wonderful, beautiful bound book, but you would have like several different books, portions of books, and then someone would bind it for you. So you might have a fiction novel and a hymn book and maybe another, maybe a how-to book, and it could all be in one bound collection. So when you talk about book, it has a little bit different look than it does today. Anyway, this Ach Liederbuch is the first one that they recognize, and our song that we're going to be looking at is not in this one. And then I don't have the next big one on here, but it's the Erfährter Enchiridion, which is so wonderful because this is the one where they believe it was printed in two different locations, and they believe that one printer stole the galley sheets from a different one in order to print them at there, and because they realized this was making money. Outside of these books, there were pamphlet versions, individual songs, and they were going like hotcakes. So everyone wanted this. Everybody felt this call to have these hymns that they could help them learn the faith. Moving on, the Weisse Gesangbuch is one of the ones that went outside of Germany, just a little bit, some German-speaking lands, but they moved into Bohemia. They move into Switzerland. And then the crown jewel is the Baptiste Gesangbuch of 1545. This is the model for hymn books. If you remember the last Presbyterian hymnal, the blue one, it literally is modeled off the Baptiste hymn book, where there's a psalter in the middle, exactly what they did in that one. And that became the standard model for hymn books really up until present. Glory to God is cool and different, went away from that. I'm almost out of time, so I want to just finish up here. The other one I wanted to point out is the Geistliche Gesangbuchlein. These hymns that are printed in these texts are not printed like we have today in 4 parts. There's just a melody line. However, it's this Geistliche Gesangbuchlein, 1524, and that image. You can go on to the next image here. I'm sorry, it's not on here. It's on my other one. It's a part book. And it's not like we have where everyone sees all the parts, but each person gets a part book. It was really popular in the Renaissance, if you've studied Renaissance music at all. So the sopranos would have their little book. Telling us, though, that there was a performance aspect to this as well, and an expectation also that people were learning to read music. So that's the first one. We end up, it's important to know at this point in time that the melodies are all in a tenor. The melody will be adopted to the soprano in 1560 by a composer named Lucas Osiander. So that's going to start the tradition of putting our melody in a soprano. And then finally, this is where I'm going to pretty much end my portion of this. Where does it go from here? As I said, this idea that we have 4-part harmony and modern harmony is going to emerge from that, and we'll talk about that more when we sing our song. Another thing that stems from this tradition, though, is even though you get this kind of wonderful, wholesome, idealized hymn tradition through Baptist tradition, because the hymns are so popular, people use these for propaganda reasons, and to not only promote the faith, but also to promote political idealism. So I talked a lot about, instead of just spiritual songs, if you will, correct songs that correctly represent the state. And there's no division of church and state, so that's how the promotion is. So they start to promote maybe the leader, or they are used as polemical tools against something else. So you'll see, for example, in a lot of anti-Roman Catholic information coming through the hymns, right? Luther wrote one of these that was really well known. It was upholding a couple martyrs that were martyrs, evangelical martyrs, against the Roman Catholics. You'll see them against the Turks. You'll see them against the Anabaptists. So we don't think of hymns as having this kind of negative tone, but this does become part of the tradition as well. And you have to be really careful. There'll be these publications that will come out with this junk in there, and then you'll see these better theologians coming in and saying, no, that's not a good publication, don't buy it. Not unlike today. The other thing I pointed out today, and just at the very end, is what about us Presbyterians? Well, we're from the Reformed tradition, where if it wasn't distinctly pointed to being important in Scripture, then we didn't use it. So our tradition became the Psalter, Old 100th, right? So this hymn tradition, in terms of our hymn books today, really didn't come alive till really the 19th century. So we're just singing a lot of psalms without accompaniment, all in unison. So that was, the Frozen Chosen. That's for that. That's for that kind of idea. Help support that concept, because they were just singing these and slow. Oh, as slow as you could possibly sing. Oh. But you were supposed to be thinking about the words and seeing how they were leading you to your faith. So that's little conclusion. On my part, the hymn tradition impacted form, style, and practice of what comes today. Introduced congregational hymn singing within the service. I didn't talk much about that, but it sets us up for what we do today. Emphasis on learning through hymns. And my question marks today are, how do we react to new styles with performance in the church? Do we adopt new hymns? Do we try to go back and resurrect old hymns? Do we accept changes in the language? So all those kinds of question marks, I think, are fair within the hymn tradition. So that's my part. I'm going to turn over to Chris. He's going to tell you some different things.
Ask you this question. You're 20 years old in 2020. That's nice, all kinds of 20 there, so it's easy to remember. 20 years old, 2020. What choices do you get? What choices do you get in your life? Yeah. What are some of the main ones, the major ones, major life choices you get that you have control over? Okay, so what job you get to do besides church, if you even believe in it. Besides church, if you even believe in it. If you even believe in church, you get to have that choice, right? You get to choose if you want to be married or not. You get to choose if you want to have kids. You can be married and have kids, or be married and not have kids, or not be married and have kids. There's lots of different options here, right? This is the world we live in today. It's a world of choice. And the concept, the idea of choice, of options, of autonomy, it begins, to some extent, in the European Renaissance. Prior to that, the worldview was very different. The worldview was that nobody really had choices. So to kind of drive this home, there's a famous Saint Hildegard of Bingen. and very important female mystic of the Western world. And Hildegard, so I work very closely with Dr. Martina Saltamacchia over at UNO in the Medieval and Renaissance program. She and I do medieval and Renaissance things and collaborations all the time throughout the year. And we brought a speaker in who gave a talk on some of Hildegard's writings. And Hildegard's talking about one of her things that she's famous for is she was a great healer in the European world. In fact, kings and queens from all over Europe would come to her when they were ailing so that they could get cured. And so she wrote a huge treatise called Physica, which was basically all of her recipes for treatments and cures for these different illnesses. And many times at the end of the treatment, it will say, unless this doesn't work. Unless this doesn't work. And so everyone laughed, okay? But we missed the point. Because we get so much choice, we kind of laugh because we think, oh, it's not working. Hildegard was comfortable with that. Her worldview was that if God decides it's time for you to leave this earth, there's nothing you can do. It's actually quite profound what she's saying. And if we think about their worldview, the understanding that we all just are here, and we all have the things that we've been designated to do, it's basically a caste system. Kings and queens don't get to decide they don't get to be that either. So there are all kinds of instances where they didn't want to have to do that, but they had to do it as well. And then Montaigne writes in a very famous essay on education that if the bread baker should be the king and the king should be the bread baker, then by Jove, let's make that happen. That's better for society, right? That was like a groundbreaking idea into the Enlightenment era at that point. So this is a pretty new idea. Human beings getting to choose what they want to do is very recent. Society for 100,000 years, if you want to call it that, if you want to extend way back into the entire realm of the Homo sapien on Earth, we have not tended to live that egalitarian. It's been much more like the medieval concept. And why is this? Because whether we may find it abhorrent in the modern world today, but through most of human history, it's the easiest way to guarantee that society continues to move forward in something that's not chaos. So if you just control people and make them stay in their places for 1,000 years at a time, it's better for society, is the belief, right? So all of this starts to be challenged with what we call the Renaissance era. It's getting challenged. There are little challenges happening that are just getting crushed by the Catholic Church prior to the Reformation. But the Reformation is like the perfect storm. You have a pope who's spending so much that he bankrupts the Catholic Church. Can you imagine? He bankrupts the Catholic Church. So what does he do? Does anybody know what he does? He says, well, what we can do is we can sell the grace that because saints have so much grace, they don't need all that grace, and it's stored in heaven. And since I have the keys of Peter, because it says so in this Bible verse, I can sell that to people who pay me, and then they can get that grace, and then they can get out of purgatory faster. And creates essentially an economic system for the church to replenish the money that's been spent on the Renaissance. And this thing happening, coupled with printing press developing, people start to develop better forms of communication, things can travel faster because of the printing press, and just the general societal change that human beings should have more autonomy over their individual freedom, it really results in the Reformation. That's what happens. So the early church didn't care if you got to participate in the music making. That was not a priority. It wouldn't have been your priority either. You wouldn't have cared either. The worldview, once again, was that that's not your job. Somebody else does that. There's people who do that. And oftentimes these people were extremely talented. They were doing this, especially in the medieval era, by the time they were children, and they spent their entire lives doing it. They had these things memorized. I mean, we're talking they probably had hundreds and hundreds of chants memorized from the church services. They were really, really talented musicians. So the musical performances that are happening, especially at the major churches, like the Notre Dame Cathedral or the big cathedral centers throughout Europe, they were fantastic. I mean, it was like a great music concert. And it was the cutting edge. If you were at Notre Dame Cathedral, during today we call it the Notre Dame School, if you were hearing the music of Léonin and Perrotin, probably people that aren't on your playlists, but nonetheless, if you're listening to them back then, this is like the cutting edge. Every week, it's exciting. But it can't be sung by people like us. You have to spend lots of time studying this music. Professional musicians today, professional vocal musicians today, struggle heavily and mightily with performing this late medieval music. So, when the Reformation happens, part of the egalitarianism that comes into the artistic expression of the church is that everyone should be able to participate in the music making. So you can't sing that stuff. So where do they look for music? They look for places where music exists that people sing. To some extent, it's kind of there's a folk movement. Sometimes it's beer drinking songs. We have these kinds of songs like this that are getting incorporated because it's tunes people know. They have to be practical. There's a real sense of practicality about church music making that comes with the Reformation. That's great. But like everything, there's advantages and disadvantages. So, what's the disadvantage? The disadvantage is that if you sing something that's pretty easy to sing, 7 verses of it, how do you feel on verse 5? Right? That's a real thing, though. We feel bad saying it in church or something. Okay? So right off the bat, you have these early German musicians they're already starting to mess with it. They start incorporating improvisation. They start doing different things with the tunes. As soon as the organ starts to really take off and develop as an instrument, they start messing around with the registrations, which means they start to change the different stops and sound possibilities. Essentially, an organ is like a pre-electric synthesizer. You can think of it that way. So they start to use different types of sounds and incorporate all of these things. They try to bring out different meanings. If you have one verse that's really happy and one verse that's really sad, but they're both in D major, you got to do something to make that sad verse sound a little sad. So they start to incorporate these kinds of ideas. So what this does is really, really important to the history of Western aesthetics. Because, and also within a larger framework of the Renaissance in general, it starts to create the idea that novelty and innovation is a landmark expectation for the quality masters that are making art in the European system. That's actually quite different from the rest of the world. You have styles like Hindustani classical music. So Hindustani classical music is one of the major artistic musical forms of what's today India. It's very old. It's much, much more ancient even than Western music is. They aren't interested in the least with innovation. In fact, they're skeptical of you if you try to bring new ideas to Hindustani forms. The whole entire point is that you study with a guru. The guru teaches you every single thing the guru knows, and that guru learned it from his or her guru, and it goes back and back and back. And in fact, the pride of being a Hindustani musician today is being able to trace your guru lineage back thousands and thousands of years, usually to mythical godlike beings who have become totally enlightened and have experienced nirvana way back into prehistory, for the most part. So, I live in 2023. I'm not 20 years old. But I live in 2023. I'm a musician that has to think this way today. I have to be able, in a church service, I can't play for you 7 verses of Christ lay in death's strong bonds and just play it. And you're not just going to say to me like you would have 600 years ago or something, oh, this is so great that we're all getting to participate. You're going to be like, come on, you're doing this thing the same way again. That's what everybody's going to think right today. And this is also bringing about some of the arguments and the challenges that we're experiencing in modern church music, because now we have the introduction of novelty. There's still this strong desire for novelty. So praise music comes into this. We've been talking about really traditional hymns in bar form, kind of the first, the ur-text, if you want, of the hymn or something. But today, of course, a huge amount of Christians worldwide are experiencing forms and styles of hymnody that really aren't even connected in any kind of way musically, historically, to what the church and even the Reformed churches even Catholic churches would have experienced, as what they would have recognized as hymns. So how does this all come together? Everything influences another thing, and in turn becomes influenced by that thing. So I'm going to play for you now something that is past the Reformation. It was written after the Reformation, and it's something called an alternatum mass. It's Catholic. So this is an example of the Catholic Church, while they're killing people who are practicing in Reformed traditions, they're also stealing ideas from them. Because this is human beings. They know a good idea when they see it. These are sharp people. So this is an alternatum mass. So what is an alternatum mass? Alternatum masses were practiced in what's called the French classical period. So this is largely, we're talking about 16 and 1700s here. And this style of music would have been performed where you would have had somebody chant, the original chant, that would have been the chant that had been done way into deep medieval era, the early stuff. Just a little piece of the chant. And then the musician, usually an organist, but sometimes it could have been a small string ensemble or something like that, they would have then played some kind of an arrangement. Essentially, it would have been very improvisatory in feel. People today still go over to France to study these French classical styles, especially organists do. They study this because they want to capture the flavor and the spirit, because a lot of what you do isn't written on the page. A lot of it is just would have been embellished and improvised. And so we have to learn these kind of cultural little obstacles that we have to get past of not understanding that music anymore. So the tune is a very famous chant. It's the Pentecost chant. So if you were a Catholic person prior to Vatican II, when you went to church on Pentecost Sunday, you would have heard chanted or chanted yourself Veni Creator, which is a very, very important chant. To this day, some of the most important organ pieces that have ever been written are improvisations or are improvisatory-like pieces that have been written on the tune Veni Creator. It's a very important tune. So here it is. That's it. Simple, beautiful, very beautiful in a gigantic European cathedral with 10-second reverberation. Very beautiful. How does this work? In this work, the tune is in the bass, and it sounds like this. It's right there, right? Exact same tune. But it's in the bass, but it's very slow. So this is hearkening back to a much older style called the cantus firmus style, where you're going to have this. The melody is going to be in the bass. It's going to be in the tenor or the bass, and it's not going to be in the soprano. Here's what it sounds like when everything is added for the embellishment. On and on and on. So it continues. So we hear one of the great dangers of improvisation that wouldn't have been a problem for Catholics. Because Catholics don't care if they sing or not. To some extent, it's still a contemporary issue with Catholics. So that's not important to them. It was certainly not important to them back then. But that is important. It's actually, in some ways, central to the theology, to Reformed theology. So you have to be able to present in improvisations. Bach can't do that. He can't make the tune so buried and so unavailable to the people, especially when they're actually singing. He can do that in the offertory and things like that, but he can't do that when they sing. So he comes up with a really, really different style, and they start to experiment with things, like placing the melody out, getting it out of the bottom of everything. If it's the basement, you can't hear it very well, but if you get it up into the attic, then it sounds a lot brighter, and you catch on to it a lot faster. And they start to develop a whole system of ways to just slightly embellish it that become basically the beginning of what we today call tonal theory. It's the entire theory of Western music grows out of some of this stuff that happens. And he starts to see the murkiness of some of the things that are happening because of the modes, the ancient modes that are being used. And he starts to tighten all that up and starts to create what we call today the tonal system of music. This all completely changes the whole entire cultural expression of the West. And so I'm someone who sits down today, and if I have to play Amazing Grace for you, and I do something like this, you can sing to that. You know, it's probably pushing it. Some people will grumble. But you can sing to it. Okay? I can make that work because there's hundreds of years of rules and playbooks. My job has become, to some extent, to find the middle ground between being somebody who's interested in innovation and also trying to trace my guru lineage back to J.S. Bach. I have to kind of try to find the middle ground as the musician. So that's what a church music degree is to some extent. That's what it is to study, to play in a church that's valuing this type of music still, that wants to have this contemplative experience, that wants to connect to the past through hymnody, that doesn't want to just throw the latest thing that was written 20 minutes ago in front and then never sing that thing ever again. You know, that kind of church, you're kind of in the middle ground here, trying to figure out how to fit in the two. And so it all stems back to that basic thing that happened in our culture, choice. Choice and autonomy. It causes problems. Sometimes choice makes things that you don't like, first of all, right? Sometimes whole entire denominations can choose to do things musically that you just think are terrible. Like, that's a reality of choice. Choice. And this is exactly what, if you read the writings of the founding fathers of the country, or if you read the writings before them, so if you read the French writings that inspired them, this is the problem of liberty. This is the problem of freedom, is that you have to be able to deal with the fact that not everyone agrees with you when you're not just all living in a society where everyone says, stay in my lane, this is what God made for me. I'll take this medication unless it doesn't work. Right? So that's my contribution today. I know we're gonna sing here in a little bit and but I wanted to kind of show how you get this Catholic music that is directly being inspired by the very music that it's politically, totally opposed to and murderously opposed to. I mean, there are wars that are being fought, and at the same time, the Counter-Reformation is beginning to form, which is a style of music that's all being, it's like kind of loosely based on traditional Catholic ideas, but when we have the privilege to look back hundreds of years and see all these things happening, we can clearly see that what's really happening here is a political assimilation of the style. They're taking these styles that are developing in Germany, primarily in Germany at the time, and they're totally using them to reshape the Catholic message because they see how interesting and they see how much popularity is coming. It's basically an economic decision. Thank you.
Feel it, right? So Chris is going to help me with the sheet that I handed out here with one of my hymns, but it's so, I mean, the segue here is so perfect because I want you to hear this really famous song. What was the hymn number of this?
237.
237. Because we have some of Luther's stuff still in our hymn books. And I'm going to have him play actually the way that Walter had, the melody that Walter had, which is printed for you. It looks kind of like a modern hymn. Play that melody so you can hear, because it's still, if you will, not in modern tonality. It's still modal. And you'll hear that when he plays it. You'll be like, oh, really? And then we'll sing. We're going to sing all these verses. Verses 1, 3, and 4 are actually written by Luther. These are English translations, of course. So, and I want you, as we sing the whole hymn, to listen, for how Bach turns it into a modern tonal piece, and also to think about the words, in particular of 1, 3, and 4, that Luther had written. So if you would play that melody for us there. Doesn't sound like it's in our modern hymn book, does it? Let's sing. Let's enjoy a song together. I chose it because it's Easter time, so or not quite, but we can sing this during Lent and up through Easter. guarantee that major chord was not part of the original, right? I mean, yeah, we hear it in tonal, but it wasn't written that way. So really, really good. Just to think of how something has changed. And I didn't give you Luther's version, which was actually even more, as Chris was pointing out, the simpler for people to sing. And Luther's version was even a little bit more disjointed than that, which was probably typical at the time, but still, it's going to be even easier if we just make it simpler to sing. Just a couple of notes on the bottom here. Luther had seven verses. Now, we were already tired, right, at 4. And when I would do hymn books, I had a couple that had it over 50 verses. And they fully expected you to sing 50 verses, by the way. Yeah, it's insane, right? Would have been sung originally in unison. This is, we talked about the Bach's use of this. The cantata number 4 uses this text. So if you want to go listen for that, you can hear so much of what Chris and I both talked about just listening to Bach's cantata. Set in German bar form, that typical simple form. A lot of the folk songs were in that A-A-B. The A is where we see the repeat, and then the B is a little bit longer. It's kind of that longer part. And so that was very typical for German popular song. And this has roots in the Victime Pascali Laudus and Christ ist erstanden, which is another Luther hymn. So he's got kind of blending together the Gregorian chant and yet adding in this kind of Reformation song. So that's what we're seeing here. But I want to take a second and just, I shut it. What was the number again?
237.
Thank you. Why'd I do that? Because I did. No, I can't get there. So just take a look for a minute. What you see, remember 1, 3, and 4 particularly, in terms of theology that you're seeing. What did you learn from this? Oh, I got it wrong again. Man. We don't think about this because this is our theology, or parts of it.
Christ died for our offenses.
Yep.
But now Christ brings us light from heaven.
Mm-hmm.
So we should be joyful
Mm-hmm.
and thankful and sing praises as the first fruits.
Good. What else? I mean, these are pretty obvious, right? This is simple words, but yet, when you really read it, I really like a couple things. One of the things that Luther was a man, Reformation man, but he's still very medieval in his thought process, and he does spend a lot of. The medieval church had a lot of. There was a lot of imagery of evil and Satan in the concept, which is not so much where we are in the modern church. And so you see that here, right? That dualism between light and dark that you tend to see in Luther and the medieval. So you can read that in here. The second verse we didn't read was all about dark and evil, and so they took that out for our modern ears. But so you can see it here too, can't we? That kind of battle against evil.
Christ has crushed the power of God.
Yep. Yep.
Reference to the Passover.
Yes. Yes. So we see scripture in here too, right? Little bits of pieces of scripture.
In medieval Christology.
Yes, thank you.
And what do you mean by that?
So medieval Christology is the practice in the medieval church and the ancient church of finding, of looking back into before Christ, looking into the Testament, and looking for signs of Christ's prophecy. Like, for example, in Passover, that's a Christological moment because the idea is that they would, dip the brush in the lamb's blood, and then they would go here, and then they would go on the signpost. So that was an ancient concept, was that the sign of the cross was being made way before the cross on the doors of people to show that Christ was coming.
To pick up that emptying of Christ, we see that Christ empties himself. This idea of kenosis, it empties himself, right? He did this. He died for us to save us.
And then the fourth stanza is just full of rejoicing.
Yeah. Interesting, right? You have this together, right? But then you have this rejoicing side. And notice this. I think this really exudes this freedom that we get from it as well. I feel that that's also in this hymn. And also, real interesting, and Chris might be able to add this Alleluia at the end, I think, is interesting as well, because that wouldn't have been in a typical Lenten hymn.
Yeah.
So it's kind of right on that. And yet, I mean, I think we could say this is Easter, but I think we could also sing it before Easter. I mean, I think it goes kind of both. So it's a kind of an interesting addition. And it wasn't originally in, it is in this one up here, but in Luther's, it wasn't in his original. It was added a little bit later.
I'm just kind of spitballing here, but it could be, if you think of it as an Easter and you're thinking about who Luther was, it could very well be once again the medieval sensibility of like the Paschal sacrifice.
Yeah.
The idea that like Easter is not just about the joy, which is kind of what we kind of have separated the Paschal into Good Friday, and then we but this would have been much more contained in both.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I can almost see it as like an Easter vigil kind of song, right?
Yeah, like a first hymn.
Like a first hymn.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that was just one fun one, and we're pretty well out of time. I guess maybe we should ask some questions,
Yeah,
or
sure.
if you have some questions for us.
You mentioned the phrase secular hymnody, and I never thought about hymns being secular. Coming from secular melody, sure, but could you tell us more about that?
Just the practice of singing them outside of the church. So, for example, someone like Ulrich Zwingli, who, if in that tradition, got rid of all music, even the metrical psalms in the sanctuary, was still singing all kinds of sacred things outside, more towards a secular audience. Was a fine musician, but didn't think it should be anywhere in the sanctuary. So you also saw this in to some extent, the Roman Catholic tradition had this wonderful, beautiful, professional music level stuff, but people are learning these these hymns outside of the actual sanctuary, if you will. They're going to various types of lay gatherings, and the division between sacred and secular isn't necessarily as defined as it is today, because everyone's Christian, right? Everybody is connected somehow to the church, and we have, for example, all kinds of festivals that are going on. We have roots today. For example, Halloween, All Hallows Eve. The spooks come out before All Saints Day, right? So we see that today, but today we don't realize that Halloween is even embedded into a religious tradition. So they have all these kinds of secular things that are going on that we would view as secular, but are kind of in between, where hymns and songs are being written and sang. Does that make sense?
I was wondering about you said you'd seen some of the individual pamphlets. What did they each combine?
So, by the time some of the pamphlets are separate, but like they'll be like folios. So in fact, most of them don't even have numbers. The earliest books, I didn't find numbers in the books I looked at until about 1560. So I'd have to go look at the folio page to mark out, if I'm going to reference it, what the folio page is. So it'd be like C3 or whatever on each folio. So then they would take that, and then they'd usually use some kind of, sew them together, and then there was usually a leather bound on top of that, usually often with a gorgeous clasp on it. So
No, I meant the pamphlets. What did they use?
the individual,
They use tables, but what they use?
usually those are single, like broadsheets.
Oh, gotcha. Oh.
Yeah. Now the Auchnida book pieces, those were different. And as they said, like they were published in like miniature folios, just in folio beforehand. And I'm trying to remember how those were attached together. Well, I only saw them after they were bound. So that's a good question. I'm not actually sure how those are bound together before, if they are at all, if there's some kind of clasp. I'm not sure. It's a good question. Be something to look for.
Do you have any take on the future?
No.
I think, how can I say that? I think that we're in an interesting time in that we live, this is a little bit my own opinion, but I can support my opinions with facts. So I think that we live in a time that ostensibly feels like we have lots of options, but we actually have fewer options than people had 100 years ago. I think that a lot of the nature of the way that technology and interests, economic interests, corporate interests, things like this, the way that these things are all coming together and positioning, oftentimes without very much transparency, is being done to provide people with what they understand. We have culturally become interested in having options, but they don't actually all the time, it's not always economically good for you to actually have options. Because once again, I said, right, 100,000 years of no options. So I think that what we are experiencing today is a time where we have to figure out how to take these new technologies as they're developing, just as they did in this time, to promote them towards the general good of having autonomy and freedom in our lives. And I think that right now we're struggling with that. So musically, for example, there are really, if you look at the way that modern popular music is constructed, it's not an autonomous experience. It's mostly done, everything is sampled now, and there are like drum beats that are already recorded, and it's a completely different way of putting together music that really has nothing resembling the autonomy that musicians would have had 100 years ago when they sat down to be inspired to write a piece of music and to put it down onto paper. So I think that the future is very hard to say what it's going to look like, because it largely depends on whether or not people continue to decide to choose autonomy, true autonomy, which requires transparency and it also requires disagreement. Or will we choose to continue to pretend like we have autonomy in order to feel like we have options that we may or may not actually have? That's my personal opinion.
What is your take on the theology of praise songs?
They vary. I mean, some of them are quality and some of them aren't. I mean, I think, and that's not really my expertise, but I have noticed with praise songs, a combination of some of those songs that are out there. I mean, I kind of lump them all into one, but some of them are really designed to be performance things, right? Like, someone's performing it and you're listening. And I think a lot of churches think, oh, well, I want to mimic that, and so they actually create that for their service, where all of a sudden, instead of a congregation that's interactive, you pretty much have a performance. Some of them actually are designed for others to participate in, so that's one difference right there I've seen. I don't know that body work very well. We did some of it in a seminary. I'm sure there's folks here that know it better than I do. So some of it seems really rich, and some of it really doesn't. So I think you get the spectrum. But I can in the hymn book as well, right? In the hymn book. What's so interesting is, we love Glory to God. It has so many choices for us, but the thousands of hymns. I went to go look some of these old Reformation hymns, how many are actually in here? There's really not very many at all, and some of the other ones that were considered to be the most. There's a piece by a woman in the Reformation named Elizabeth Kreuziger. It was one of the best hymns, and it's not here anymore, so we've moved beyond it. Yeah.
A good example kind of what I was saying earlier would be this. So everybody alive today has, generationally speaking, of course there are outliers individually, but everybody has basically been raised on television. I mean, the people who are alive today, generally speaking, have had television as a daily part of their lives. So we've known since ancient times that music has this almost magical ability to elicit certain emotions. Like for reasons that scientists still don't even understand today, certain kinds of chords and harmonies and melodies and tempos and things can create different kinds of feelings in you, right? So you watch a movie without the music or without the sound on is a very different experience than watching the soundtrack. So people have known for a very long time now, almost 100 years worth of mainstream corporate knowledge, that if they put this kind of sound with this kind of image, you're all being socially conditioned to respond emotionally to that in a certain way. So now that's starting to filter into church experience. So let's go ahead and let's start out. We want to get everybody revved up in this thing. We're going to do this. And so it's like we're basically throwing down, not we, but the people who are thinking in this kind of way. They're going to completely control every emotional thing that you do throughout the service because of your deep connection to already having experienced that against your will many times. So this is, in my opinion, a blurring of what Luther would have considered theological autonomy, the ability to access the scriptures yourself and to be able to take that in and to hear God's presence in your life and make your decisions for what needs to happen in your own life and in the life of the community, etc. I think that this would be an example of where it will depend. The future of church music will depend on where people want to go with that.
That's really interesting. Because we talked about one of the problems with the medieval church was that the words got so convoluted because there were so many different melody lines going together, and it was beautiful to listen to.
Yeah.
Moved your passions, but it didn't necessarily, you couldn't understand it. And so the reformers were, and the Renaissance, actually some of the Renaissance writers, we want to hear the words. We want to know what the words are saying. And of course, the Reformed tradition we don't want the music to be a bother to it, only to be, so we can just listen for words, which is, interesting. So,
Yeah, in some ways it's as we see growing resources in the hands of the few, the fewer and fewer it's happened, and we can trace that. That's just common knowledge and objective fact. It's going to resemble more and more the medieval era. Because just that is one of the things. So as the resources started to spread out, development of the middle class, that all these types of things are coinciding with the Enlightenment era, with the Reform, all these things that are happening. And then as you move away from the basic economic realities of what it is to be a human being in your land, you're going to have a different experience. I had a brilliant professor once who was a Slavic linguist, and he would always say, people don't do things because of the ideas, they do things for the food.
yeah.
And he was being funny, but it was also profound. He was saying that in the end, you can have all the fancy ideas you want, but if people are starving to death, they're going to do the thing they need to do to get food. And so he was saying that you can look back and see how all these different traditions, and he studies a part of the world where you have Jews, and you have Muslims, and you have Orthodox Christians, and you have Protestant Christians, and you have Catholic Christians all living and fighting each other. Sometimes they like each other, sometimes they hate each other. It's like that's the history of where he studies. And he's saying about that, you can say so-and-so converted for this, or you can write whatever you want in your little story that we're reading back now, 500 years later, but sometimes it was just for the food. I mean, it was. That's a human reality.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I think musicians have always known about emotional manipulation through timbre and meter and modalities.
Yeah, for sure. The ancient Greeks used to send out when they would fight a...
Perfect fourth, perfect fifth.
Yeah.
Just said to speak back.
No, we've known, in fact, like 2 examples. So the ancient Greeks used to, when they would fight battles, they would send their harp players out to to strum feminizing music to the opposing forces to weaken them before battle. And it was like, close your ears, And then another example we have is the word yinye in Chinese. The yinye is the same root of the character yinye, which is music, is also the same root for the Chinese character for the word medicine. So they understood these are very ancient understandings that music in some way has this really, truly profound medicinal, healing, magical effect on people. And to this day, like I said, scientists are still trying to figure out, why does this sound sad?
Yeah.
Why? And they haven't really come up with good answers yet. We don't
Yeah.
understand the brain well enough yet.
Well, obviously that was put in Luther's big things, and how can we use that in a church, whereas the Reformed tradition recognizes it as well, and how is that taking away from the pure Word of God? So everyone knew it.
Yeah.
Everybody knew it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Double-edged sword.
Yeah.
One thing that struck me during this whole discussion, especially what Chris was saying, was about the accessibility of music now, as opposed, when I was a kid, we had a huge stereo and a collection of huge records, and that's how we listened to music. And I went to the gym before I came here, and I listened to music from my phone on my wireless earbuds.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I mean, how I experienced it in the classroom, you probably did too. I mean, as it evolved, is I've seen an evolution of what we call like mile wide, inch deep. So as people can consume so much, they consume like the introductory levels of everything.
Right.
And there isn't like that deep dive. And so our students, the music students that we get now, the challenge for them in trying to teach classes like this, trying to get people to access these really, to be able to, perform French classical music on the organ, for example, or to be able to perform an early Haydn string quartet, it's going to require a pretty deep dive of that human being. It's a commitment to be able to understand that culture. And if you're a person who's been conditioned since you were 5 years old to be listening to like Mongolian pop music and then some African thing that you found that was really cool and this and that, and it's just all over the place like that, these people have really, really wide and diverse listening. They understand a lot of different styles a little bit, a little tiny bit. And so we have to take them in music school then and transform them into the deeper listeners they're going to need to be able to perform within a system. And also at the same time, incorporate that wide diversity that they have, which is the current reality of the world.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.